In the autumn of 1883, in the high country east of the Nevada border, where the Humboldt Range shoulders up into cold sky, and the pinyon pines grow thick along the ridgelines, a silver mine called the Caldera Vein sat under 32 feet of black water and had sat that way for 11 years. The men who had filed the original claim were long gone. The company that had leased it after them had drilled 3 shafts, run timber frames into 2 of them, and then watched the underground water table shrug upward after a particularly wet winter, filling the works in a matter of weeks. The company had pulled its equipment, written the loss into a ledger somewhere in San Francisco, and never returned. The land title had passed twice more through the hands of men who looked at the flooded portal, heard the water moving in the dark below, and decided their money was better spent elsewhere. By the time the Elko County Assay Office listed the Caldera Vein for sale in the summer of 1883, the asking price had been reduced 4 times. The county auctioneer described it, without particular malice, as a hole full of water attached to a worthless ridge. Mabel Crane paid $62 for it on a Tuesday morning in September, with every man in the auction room watching. She was 27 years old, slight, with calloused hands, and a way of standing that made it clear she had already considered and rejected whatever the person across from her was about to say. She had come from Elko, on the stage with a canvas bag over one shoulder, and a small, steel-sounding reel, wound with 60 feet of braided cord in the other hand. The auctioneer had called the Caldera Vein at $80 to open, and when no other hand went up, he had lowered it to $70, and then to $62 when Mabel raised hers. Someone behind her said something quiet that drew a short laugh from the row of men along the wall. She did not turn around. She took the deed from the county clerk, folded it into her coat pocket, and walked outside into the September morning. If you have ever felt the quiet pull of a thing the world has discarded, wondered whether what everyone dismissed still holds something worth finding, stay with this story. What she did next in that Nevada high country belongs in the record. Her uncle, a mining engineer named Paul Crane, who had worked pump operations in the Comstock lodes through the 1860s and early 1870s, had taught her everything she knew about water in a mine. He had died of a lung complaint in the winter of 1879 when Mabel was 23, leaving her his field journal, his transit, and a 12-pound pump wrench she kept wrapped in oilskin at the bottom of her canvas bag. Paul had believed, with the patience of a man who had watched water and watched rock long enough to understand how they argued with each other, that every flooded mine had a story to tell if you read the water correctly. He had spent 2 seasons on a drowned shaft near Virginia City, studying the rate at which the water level rose and fell with the seasons, before concluding that the underground source was not an aquifer but a fault-fed seep, controllable with the right equipment and the right timing. That shaft had been pumped dry 3 years. After everyone said it could not be done, Paul Crane had not stayed to see the silver come out. He had moved on to the next problem as he always did. He had brought her into the field for the first time when she was 14, on a survey job in the Owens Valley. She had carried the transit rods and learned to hold them plumb by watching his hand signal, the smallest correction, left or right, delivered in a half-inch motion of 2 fingers. In the evenings, he had gone through his field journal with her, explaining what each notation meant and why the sequence of numbers told a different story than any single figure in isolation. A mine's water was never one thing, he had said. It was a record, a history of where the water had come from and what it had moved through on the way. If you read the record correctly, you could predict what the water would do next and work with that prediction rather than against it. The men who failed in flooded shafts were the men who fought the water as if it were an enemy. The men who succeeded were the men who understood what the water was trying to tell them. She had listened to this from the age of 14, and she had not forgotten a word of it. After Paul died, she had read his field journal from the first page to the last, 3 times, till she understood not just what he had written, but why he had written it in the sequence he had, what each question had been before it became an answer. The journal was small, pocket-sized, bound in worn brown leather with a cord tie, and she kept it with the wrench in the canvas bag she carried everywhere. They were the 2 things she had of his that still had use in them. That was how he would have wanted it kept. She had been working as a surveyor's assistant in Elko for 2 years, spending her evenings in the county records office whenever she could, reading every claim report, every assay return, every engineer's assessment on file. The county clerk, a deliberate man named Oates who wore the same brown vest every day and had apparently worn it since before the war, had regarded her with polite skepticism. The first time she came in and asked for the claims register, he had warmed to her slowly over the course of several months, because she always returned the files in the order she had found them and never folded a corner or left a document reversed in its folder. By the spring of her 2nd year, he left the relevant drawer unlocked when he expected her and said nothing about it. She had found the Calder Ravine report on a Tuesday evening in April. The original company's engineer had described a strike of good-grade silver chloride ore in the 3rd shaft, 30 feet down, before the flooding took the works. He had estimated recoverable ore at a figure that made Mabel set the report down and read it again. Then he had noted that the flooding source appeared to be a seasonal fault seep, not a true aquifer, and had recommended a centrifugal pump operation as a possible remedy. The company had not pursued it. The report had been filed, the shaft abandoned, and the estimate had sat in the county records for 11 years, unread by anyone who understood what it meant. Mabel understood what it meant. She had spent the spring and summer of 1883 doing the arithmetic her uncle had taught her, cross-referencing the water table reports for that section of the Humboldt Range against the rainfall records for the decades since the flooding. The seep, if the original engineer's assessment was accurate, slowed to a fraction of its winter volume by late summer. September and October were the driest months. A pump of sufficient capacity, run continuously for 3 to 4 weeks at the right time of year, stood a credible chance of clearing the shaft. She had gone back to the records office 4 more times before she was satisfied with her figures. She had borrowed books from the Elko Library on hydraulic engineering and pump mechanics and read them by lamplight in her room above the surveyor's office. She had written to the state mineralogist's office in Carson City, asking for the water table records for the Humboldt Range east of the Central Ridge, and they had sent her 3 years of quarterly reports that she had gone through line by line, annotating the margins in pencil. She had done all of this before she bid on the deed. She had done all of it because Paul had been very clear on one point above all others. You do not commit your resources to a problem until you understand the problem better than the problem understands you. $62 was not much. It was at that moment 1/5 of everything she had. The pump was the problem. Mabel had $312 to her name when she bought the deed. 62 of them were now gone. The centrifugal pump she needed, the kind that could move enough water per minute to race ahead of the seep's contribution, cost $240 to hire for a season, plus freight from Reno. She had less than enough. She wrote letter. She wrote to 4 men in Elko who held mining interests and understood assay reports, laying out the original engineer's estimate and her own water analysis in plain language, asking for short-term credit against any recovery. 3 of the 4 letters went unanswered. The 4th came back with a brief note from a man named Aldrich, who ran a hardware concern and had a piece of an operating claim on the other side of the range. He wrote that the estimate was interesting and he would like to see her analysis. She rode out to meet him on a Wednesday morning, spread her papers on his counter, and walked him through every figure. Aldrich was a careful man in his mid-40s who kept his face neutral while he read and asked 2 questions, both of them precise, about the water table cross-reference and the timing of the SEEP's autumn minimum. She answered both. Without hesitation, he read through her rainfall correlation a second time. When he finished, he said that he was not prepared to extend credit, but he had a Worthington pump in a shed behind his warehouse that had been sitting idle since a claim he held had played out the previous spring. He would lease it to her for the season at $40. Freight her responsibility. She could have it the following Monday. He said one more thing as she gathered her papers. He said that the original company's engineer had been a man named Hartfield, and that Hartfield had had a reputation for conservative estimates. If Hartfield had put that figure in his report, Aldrich said it was probably a floor, not a ceiling. He said this in the same neutral tone he had used for everything else. Not as a compliment and not as encouragement, merely as a relevant fact. She had already known it, from reading 3 other Hartfield reports in the county records, but she said only that she had come to the same conclusion. Aldrich nodded and went back to his counter. It was not a centrifugal pump. It was a piston pump, older, slower, less efficient. Mabel spent that evening with her uncle's field journal open on her knee, working through the revised calculations. The piston pump moved less water per minute than she had planned for. The window to beat the SEEP's autumn volume was narrower. It was still possible, but the margin was thin, and the operation would need to run longer, which meant she would need to be on site for 6 weeks instead of 4. She wrote back to Aldrich that Monday was acceptable. The Caldera vein sat 8 miles from the nearest road, up a switchback trail that crossed a dry creek bed twice and ended in a clearing below the old mine workings. Mabel hired a mule team from a freight operator in Elko named Soto, a weathered man of 60 who had been hauling supplies to mining claims since before the Comstock ran out, and who asked no questions about a woman moving pump equipment up a mountain in September. He helped her rig the pump on the flatbed, watched her check the manifold and the piston housing in the intake line without comment, and then said, when she had finished, that he had a second mule he could loan her for the duration. A steady animal named Cato who would not startle at the pump's noise. She took him up on it. They reached the Caldera clearing on a Thursday afternoon. The portal of the main shaft was sealed with a timber frame, green with moss. Now the planks swollen and warped. Beside it, the original company had left a rusted iron tripod and a length of chain. The second shaft, which the original engineer had marked as the flooded working shaft, was 50 feet to the east, its frame partially collapsed on one side. Mabel uncapped her sounding reel and lowered the weighted cord into the shaft. The line played out through her fingers and then went still. 31 feet. The water was 1 foot higher than the 1872 assessment had recorded. She wrote the figure in her journal. Then she walked the perimeter of the clearing, measuring the slope of the ground with her transit, looking for the direction the SEEP most likely entered the workings. Her uncle had told her once that water in a mine has a character, and that character is patience. It finds the lowest crack. It does not hurry. If you want to understand where it is coming from, you find the lowest crack first, and you think like water. She found a depression in the rock face on the north wall of the clearing, a shallow channel where the stone was darker with moisture, even in September's dry air. The SEEP entered from the north, as she had suspected from the geology of the fault records. It was entering slowly, as the autumn records had predicted. She made a note. capped her transit, and began rigging the pump. Soto helped her set the equipment and then drove back down the mountain with his team, leaving the lone mule, Cato, tied to a pine at the edge of the clearing. She was alone with the mine, the pump, the mule, and the autumn light. She ran the pump for the first time that evening using the intake line threaded down through the shaft frame, the discharge running off through a timber trough she had built that morning to carry the water 40 feet clear of the clearing and down the slope. The pump was loud, a rhythmic knock and hiss that echoed off the rock face and startled a pair of ravens out of the pines. The water began to come up in the discharge line within 20 minutes, dark with rust particles and fine silt smelling of sulfur and iron. She ran it for 4 hours by lantern light, then shut it down to rest the mechanism and took a measurement. The water had dropped 4 feet. She wrote it down and went to sleep beside the pump housing, with her uncle's journal folded under her head. She ran the pump 14 hours. The second day, the water dropped 3 more feet. It rained for 2 hours in the afternoon, a thin, cold rain that did nothing to the water table, but made the timber frame slick and soak through her coat while she kept the intake line clear of silt buildup. She monitored the discharge, watching for the color and clarity of the water, which told her how much silt the shaft floor was releasing. Too much silt in the discharge meant the intake was pulling from too low, risking the line. She adjusted the intake depth twice, watching the color change, learning the rhythm of the shaft, the way her uncle had taught her to listen to a problem rather than fight it. On the third day, the discharge line seized. She had been expecting it as a possibility. The Worthington pump's piston housing had a history of silt fouling in the intake valve if the line ran too deep for too long, and Paul's notes on piston pump maintenance were precise on the sequence for clearing it. She shut the pump down, disconnected the intake manifold, and spent the better part of 3 hours with her hands in cold water, pulling the valve assembly and clearing it with the stiff bristled brush she had packed specifically for that purpose. Her hands were numb by the time she had the valve seated and the manifold reconnected. She ran the pump for an hour to confirm the line was clear, checked the discharge color, and then let the mechanism cool for 2 hours before running it again. The delay cost her a foot of recovery for the day. She wrote down the reason in the log alongside the measurement, so the record was honest. By the end of the first week, she had lowered the water level 18 feet. She was ahead of the margin her revised calculations had required, even counting the third day's delay. Cato stood at the edge of the clearing each morning and watched her with the philosophical calm of an animal who had seen stranger things on mining claims than a woman running a pump alone in the high country. She fed him grain from her pack each evening and talked to him about the water level, the way her uncle had talked to her when she was a girl learning the work, not explaining so much as thinking out loud to something that listened without judgment. She had no one else on the mountain to think out loud to, and the need to articulate the day's work, to state in plain words what the numbers meant and what they predicted for the next day, kept her from the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from turning the same problem silently in the mind until it loses its shape. The second week the seep came in stronger, as she had anticipated. A cold front moved through from the northwest, bringing 3 days of steady rain. Mabel ran the pump 18 hours a day, checking the intake line every 4 hours, sleeping in 4-hour stretches on the canvas she had spread under the pump housing overhang. The water level dropped more slowly. She fell behind her weekly target by 2 feet. She did not recalculate. She had planned for variance, and the plan still held. She kept the pump running. The rain made the work harder than the numbers could fully capture. The discharge trough filled with surface runoff, and she had to divert it twice to keep the trough from backing up into the clearing. The clearing itself grew muddy, and moving equipment across it became a different kind of labor. She rigged a board path from the pump housing to the shaft collar on the fourth day of rain. Flat planks laid end to end across the worst of the mud, and thereafter the movement was manageable if deliberate. Cato stayed under the trees at the edge of the clearing and let the rain fall on him with the resigned patience of an old animal who had been rained on many times before and had come to regard it as a condition of existence rather than a grievance. She envied him the simplicity of the view. On the 15th day she lowered the sounding reel and counted 10 feet of water remaining above the shaft floor. She sat with her back against the timber frame and ate a piece of hardtack and watched the discharge trough run and did not think about what the original engineer had written in his report. She had learned not to do that. Her uncle had been clear on the point. You do not think about what might be there until you are standing in front of what is there. Premature certainty is the thing that makes you stop paying attention to what the mind is telling you. On the 18th day, the discharge began to run clear. She took a measurement, 4 feet. The rate of drop had slowed markedly because the water column above the seep entry point was now so shallow that the seep's contribution was nearly keeping pace with the pump's output. She spent that afternoon with her journal, working through the geometry of the problem. The seep entered the shaft from the north wall, probably at a point now below water level. If she could get the water column below the seep's entry point, the pump would gain significantly on the remaining 4 feet. She needed to know where the seep entered. She lowered herself into the shaft on the original company's chain and the tripod, a descent of 12 feet to where the water surface now stood, her feet braced against the shaft timber, lantern in one hand. The shaft was timbered to a depth of about 8 feet below its original collar. Below the timbers, the rock walls were bare, damp, and gleaming. She worked the lantern slowly around the north wall. The seep was visible 4 feet below her, a dark line where water seeped in a thin sheet from a hairline fault running roughly horizontal across the stone. It was exactly where she had estimated. The fault ran at about 23 feet below the shaft collar. The current water surface was at 27, 4 feet to go. She climbed back out. She ran the pump through the night. At 4 in the morning, she measured 3 feet. At 9 in the morning, she measured 2 feet, and she could hear a difference in the pump's note, the discharge running faster now that the water column had fallen below the seep's entry point. She stood in the clearing in the October morning and listened to the difference the way her uncle had taught her to listen, the pump's knock and exhale telling her plainly that it had gotten ahead of the problem. By midday, she was standing at the collar of the shaft, sounding reel in hand, and the cord went taut at 8 inches. 8 inches of water on the shaft floor. She lowered the lantern on its hook and looked down. The shaft floor was there, 7 feet of timber framing, and then bare stone, dusty at the edges where the water had not reached, dark and slick at the center, where the last water pooled in the low point of the rock. She could see the shaft continuing downward, a second descent beyond a timber level, the original company's working shaft going another 20 feet into the mountain. She could see the ore seam from where she stood. It ran across the far wall in a diagonal band, 12 inches wide, pale gray against the darker country rock, and even in lantern light from above, she could see the metallic gleam in it, the characteristic chlorargite sheen that the original engineer had described. She had known it would be there. She had known it for 7 months. Seeing it was a different thing from knowing it. She stood at the shaft collar for a long time. The lantern swayed slightly on its hook below her, and the ore seam caught the light and released it, the pale gray band of chlorargite running diagonally across the darker wall at the bottom of the first descent, 12 inches wide. Perhaps more, running off into the rock on both sides in a way that suggested the vein continued beyond what she could see. The air that came up from the shaft was cold and had the particular smell of deep rock left long in water, a mineral cleanness beneath the iron and sulfur notes. She had not been down in a mine since the year before Paul died, when he had taken her through a working operation in a claim near Battle Mountain and showed her what good ore looked like against bad country rock. She had not forgotten. Cato watched her from his pine tree. The ore could not come out in a day. The second descent required new timbers for safety, careful assessment of the shaft walls, a proper winch and bucket system, and, at minimum, one other person who knew what they were looking at. What she had established on this October morning in 1883 was that the seep was controllable, the shaft was accessible, and the ore was where the original engineer had said it was. The rest was engineering. She took 3 pages of notes at the shaft color before she capped the lantern hook and pulled it back up. She logged the depth of the remaining water, the width of the ore seam as she could estimate it from above, the condition of the existing timbering, the apparent stability of the shaft walls, and the behavior of the pump discharge over the final 2 hours of the operation, which told her the rate at which the seep replenished the shaft. The log was dry, factual, and complete. It was the record that would matter when she sat down with the Reno Mills assay agent and discussed the cost of a second season's operation. She had learned from Paul that an honest record was worth more than a persuasive estimate. The persuasive estimate told people what you hoped. The honest record told them what the mine had actually done when someone showed up and paid attention to it. Those were different things, and the difference compounded over time. There was one other thing she needed to verify, and it was the reason she had come to the county records office in the first place, before the deed, before the pump, before any of it. In the original company's report, there had been a second document filed alongside the engineer's assessment, a supplemental letter from the company's San Francisco attorney, summarizing the lease arrangement between the company and the original claimant. The original claimant was a man named Elias Voss, who had filed the Silver Strike and then leased the development rights to the company for a term of 15 years, retaining a 5% royalty on any ore recovered. The company had flooded out and walked away in 1872, 11 years short of the lease's termination, without paying Voss a single dollar in royalties because no ore had been recovered. The lease had expired in 1877, leaving Voss with nothing but the original claim, which he no longer held because he had sold it to cover debts the following year. Elias Voss had died in 1880. His daughter, a woman named Ruth Voss, was listed in the county death register as his surviving heir. She lived, as of the last county census, in a settlement called Peavine Flat, 14 miles north of Elko. Mabel had known about Ruth Voss since April. She had not told anyone. She spent 2 more days on the mountain, confirming the pump's maintenance requirements and logging the water level at regular intervals, establishing that the seep's contribution at this time of year was manageable with periodic pumping. Then she loaded her equipment onto Cato and walked down the trail, the mine at her back, in the October afternoon. Soto met her at the road with his freight team as arranged. He looked at her, looked at Cato, looked at the pump lashed to the mule's back, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, she looked like a woman who had gotten what she came for. She said she had. He said he supposed she would want a ride to Elko. She said she would, but that she needed to stop in Peavine Flat on the way. He gave her a careful look, and then nodded and said Peavine Flat was not much out of the way. Ruth Voss was 51 years old, angular, with a directness in her manner that reminded Mabel of her uncle. She kept a small house at the edge of the settlement and worked as a seamstress. There was a dress frame in the corner of the front room, a half-finished piece pinned to it in dark wool, and the room had the smell of ironed cloth and lamp oil that Mabel associated with work done in good light over long hours. Ruth Voss made tea without being asked, and set 2 cups on the kitchen table before she sat down, and Mabel understood this to be the particular courtesy of a woman who had learned long ago that visitors who came with difficult news were better met with something warm in hand. She had been told all her life that her father's silver claim had come to nothing, that the company had lost its investment, and so had he, that the mine was flooded and worthless, and the matter was settled. When Mabel set the original engineer's report on Ruth Voss's kitchen table and told her what it said, and then set beside it the water logs from 18 days of pumping and the description of the ore seam she had seen that morning from the shaft collar, Ruth Voss read both documents without speaking. She was a careful reader. She went back twice to the engineer's estimate and read the relevant passage a 3rd time before she set the papers down. When she finished, she looked up and asked how this concerned her. Mabel explained the royalty clause in the original lease. She had brought a copy of the lease document from the county records, which she had requested 3 days before the auction, and paid Ota a small fee to reproduce in longhand. She set it on the table and found the relevant paragraph and set her finger under it. Ruth Voss read it. She said she had not known there was a royalty clause. Mabel said she had suspected as much. The attorney who had handled the lease had died in 1875, and the company had not been in the habit of informing leaseholders of their rights when exercising those rights would have cost the company money. That was the kind of thing that ended up in the records office in careful legal language that nobody without reason to look would ever find. Mabel said that the lease was expired and the claim had since changed hands, and that she was not a lawyer and could not say what a court might make of the original royalty arrangement. But she said that what she could say was this: if the Caldera vein produced ore under her operation, she intended to calculate what 5% of the original engineer's recovery estimate would have amounted to across the 15-year lease term, and she intended to settle that figure with Ruth Voss out of the first recovery before anything else. She was not able to give Ruth Voss her father's mine back. She was not able to undo 11 years of waiting. But she could settle the figure. She thought it was a debt the work owed, and she would pay it. Ruth Voss was quiet for a long time. She held her teacup with both hands and looked at the lease document copy on the table. Then she said that she had been told several times in her life that her father had been a fool for trusting the company, that there was no money in what he had left her, and that she should make her peace with it. She said she had made her peace with it. She said she had not expected someone to come to her door in October and tell her the account had not been closed. Mabel said she understood that. She said she had not expected to find the account open either, but she was not in the habit of looking away from an open account. Ruth Voss asked one more question. She asked how Mabel had found the royalty clause, given that the attorney was dead and the lease had not been registered in the county records under her father's name. Mabel said she had found it because she had read every document in the county claims files that referenced the Caldera vein, and one of them had been the original filing summary which listed the lease party. She had then requested the lease itself through the Circuit Court Archive in Carson City, which had a copy because the original attorney had filed his contracts through the circuit for notarization. It had taken 3 letters and 6 weeks to get the copy. Ruth Voss looked at her for a moment. Then she said quietly that her father had trusted a great many people in his life, and that most of them had not earned it. She set her teacup down and said she was glad to know someone had read the file. She hired 3 men from Elko the following spring, skilled shaft workers who had come east from the Comstock operations as the Virginia City yields declined. They were experienced men who had seen enough bad operations to recognize a good one, and what they found at the Caldera vein was a woman who knew the shaft's water behavior as well as she knew her own name, who kept a log that could answer any question about what the mine had done and why, and who had already arranged for new timbering in the second descent before they arrived. 2 of the 3 men stayed with her for the full 11 years of the operation. The third left after 2 seasons to take a foreman position on a claim near Winnemucca, and she hired another man in his place without difficulty, because by then the Caldera vein had a reputation among shaft workers in Elko County as a well-run job with fair wages and no missing payroll. She contracted with Aldrich for the pump for a second season at the same rate, and she arranged with a Reno mill to assay and process the ore. She wrote everything down: the daily water logs, the timber assessments, the crew wages, the freight costs, the mill receipts, every number in its place. The ledger she kept for the Caldera vein operation was precise and legible, each entry dated and explained in the same plain economical language Paul had used in his field journal. She had decided early that the ledger needed to be able to speak for the mine if anything happened to her, to be readable by any competent person who needed to understand what the operation was doing and why. It was a decision her uncle would have recognized. By the end of the first working season, she had recovered enough ore to have the mill return a figure that confirmed the original engineer's assessment had been, if anything, conservative. Aldrich had been right about Hartfield. The Caldera vein was not a motherlode. It was a sustained working mine, the kind that produced steadily and honestly over years, rather than making anyone's fortune overnight. That was what she had expected. That was what the records had told her to expect. She was not surprised. She was satisfied, which was a different and, she had come to believe, a more durable thing. She rode to Peavine Flat herself and settled the figure in coin, which he had calculated from the original estimate and the 15-year lease term, compounding the interest at the rate the county bank charged for long-term notes. The calculation had taken her a full evening in the lamp-lit room above the surveyor's office in Elko, and she had checked it twice and then given it to Oates, who had once told her he had been a bank clerk before the county hired him, and asked him to check it a third time. Oates had done so without asking why, and had confirmed the figure to the dollar. Ruth Voss counted the coin. She did not say it was too much. She did not say Mabel owed her nothing. She sat with the money on the kitchen table for a moment, looking at it the way a person looks at something they had believed for a long time was gone for good. Then she put the money in a tin box on her shelf and said she had been saving towards something for a long time, and now she supposed she could stop saving. She said it without particular emphasis, the way a person states a fact that resolves a long-standing problem, and Mabel understood from her tone that the thing she had been saving toward was not small. The Caldera vein produced ore for 11 more years through 1895, working under her operation with a steady crew and a pump schedule that she adjusted each season according to the water logs she had kept since that first September. Every autumn she ran the pump ahead of the seasonal seat minimum and logged the results in the same journal she had used since the beginning, the pages filling up in her narrow, regular hand, until the early volumes were worn at the corners from years of handling, and the entries were dense with the accumulated knowledge of what the mine was and how it behaved. She knew the Caldera vein, the way her uncle had known the shafts. He had worked not as an adversary, but as a problem with a character, one she had learned to read and work with over time. She developed a reputation in Elko County in the way that competent people sometimes develop reputations in small places, not by announcing what she could do, but by doing it, year after year, in front of the same men who had watched her pay $62 at auction and thought the joke was on her. They did not say so, and she did not give them the opportunity. The mine spoke for itself, the way her uncle had always said the work did, if you let it. She kept Paul Crane's pump wrench in the oilskin at the bottom of her canvas bag throughout the full 11 years of the mine's working life. When the Caldera vein was finally worked out in 1895, she reclaimed the Worthington pump from its storage at the Caldera site, returned it to Aldrich's warehouse with a letter of thanks and a final lease payment, and locked the mine's collar one last time herself. She stood at the shaft for a while in the October light, the same kind of October light there had been the morning she had looked down and seen the ore seam from above. The pinyon pines were the same, the rock face was the same, the faint sound of the seat moving somewhere in the deep dark of the mountain was the same. The mine was quiet now in a different way than it had been in 1883, the quiet of a place that had given what it had and was now at rest. Then she tied Cato, who was old now and moved slowly, but was still steady, to the pine at the edge of the clearing, shouldered her canvas bag, and walked down the mountain. The wrench is still in the bag, as far as anyone in Elko could tell you. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about a thing others gave up on that turned out to be worth the work. There are more stories like this one, and the next is already waiting. This story is a historical dramatization. The Caldera vein, Mabel Crane, and the other figures depicted here are fictional, drawn from the documented conditions of silver mining in the Humboldt Range during the 1,880 seconds.